Test 1 2 1 2 1 2. Okay, talk in Webster's mic.
Good day, sir.
Ruben.
Good day, sir. Good day, sir.
Good enough.
Monitored closely to allow the work to continue at least another decade.
Oh, he was fighting the ugly hand. You mean the 7th? Good morning. We're coming close to the end of the season. This is the second last program of Webster until September. So with us this morning we have a fairly mixed bag of considerable interest for you, I am quite sure. One of the people you're going to meet this morning is Dr. Michael Livingstone. You're always meeting doctors on this program, but this is a doctor with a difference. He's going to give you an inside look at family medicine if you dare to look at it. More seriously, perhaps, this morning too, you're going to meet Parsegh Kartalian from Los Angeles, who is a leader of the Armenian community in North America. And if you passed the courthouse this morning, you will see banners drawing attention to the fact that this is to make the public aware of the first genocide of the century, the massacre of the Armenians. That's not a very jolly topic. But we're going to start this morning with a very simple lesson that everyone should learn. It takes all kinds to make a world. And the intrepid Brian has been out talking to this strange man with his strange one-man submarine. Have a look at it. Look at it. Built it himself. Goes underwater. Must be a magnificent guy, and you're going to meet him right after the break.
Jim Ross is an inventor, a self-taught engineer who makes yellow submarines, and he spent...
Jim Ross is 25. He comes from Maple Ridge. He invented, produced, perfected this incredible little electric submarine about which reporter Brian Coxford now tells you all.
Jim Ross is an inventor, a self-taught engineer who makes yellow submarines, and he spent $60,000 of his own money making them operate.
Oh, I got the idea when I was about 14 years old. I was playing in a bathtub. I was playing with my cup of water I used to pour over my head and put a mouth down in the water, and I noticed that when I pushed it down in the water level inside the glass would raise up. I couldn't quite figure that out. I've been reading some books on diving at the time, and I read stuff about the physical laws associated with diving. Just putting this idea together with that idea and thinking of so many things at one time, and it just gradually came together.
It's taken 11 years to turn his yellow submarine into a production model, a self-propelled, self-contained two-man fiberglass unit. It's kind of like scuba diving. He uses 2 air tanks and makes them last 5 times longer. The sub cabin is actually an air pocket that allows 2 divers to stay underwater up to 4 hours.
Okay.
It's been a financial struggle to get this far because government bureaucrats have turned their backs on this small-time inventor.
No, they're not too much. They're not too interested in a guy like me because, well, you know, I'm not an engineer. You know, so they told me I couldn't design it. But I designed it, and I took it to engineers and had them confirm that it would work. And I took it back to the government, and they said, well, okay, so it'll work, but, you know, you can't make a go of it because you're not a businessman. But, you know, I'm slowly proving them wrong at every point. You can see the unit works. I got laughed out of more offices than you can imagine. Yeah, well, it's frustrating, but it's just one of the things you got to look at when you're working with the federal government. They only recognize other huge bureaucracies, if you will. A single guy, you know, with no engineering background. And what they want to see is they want to see a track record. They want to see, what they wanted to see is they wanted to see that I had built these units before and done it successfully before they would help me finance the development of this type of product.
And to get his yellow submarine into production with about a dozen buyers waiting in the wings, Jim Ross needs capital. His company, Argus Leisure Products of Maple Ridge, needs investors.
In the initial stage of the design, I wanted to make it simple and idiot-proof, if you will, so that anybody can get in it and operate it, and it's safe, it's easy to operate, there's not a bunch of moving parts that are going to break down. Basically for the recreation market. For scuba divers and skin divers to buy instead of buying a trail bike or a boat or a skidoo.
Any orders now?
Oh yeah, well I've got speculative orders, but I want to have some cash up front and then I can just carry right on. We're set up for production now. You know, we're just waiting for some cash to roll in here and, you know, we're set up to produce 2 units a week.
That's your problem right now, financial banking.
Yeah, well, that's one of the problems. I've just got to get the unit out. This is the first time we've been testing it. We've been ironing out a lot of little bugs, making sure the unit is 100% safe. And this is really the first time. We've been keeping it under wraps until now. But now we've got all the bugs ironed out. Now we're going to run with it.
When the Manta Ray submarine sells, it'll go for $9,500. Ross says that's still about $6,000 less than any comparable mini-sub on the market. And he says it's virtually goof-proof. It's unlikely anything could go wrong below the surface.
Oh, well, it's a lot less money. It's a lot safer. It's a lot more flexible. It'll dive deeper. It's 2-man, where the only other recreation priced submersibles on the market are 1-man, and that's dangerous in itself. Well, we use standard scuba for the air system, so you've got to have your ticket to get the bottle filled, okay? And that's good, because we avoid a lot of licensing problems. It makes it that much safer, because we know that at least the operator knows what he's doing when he's underwater.
How deep will it go?
There are no limitations on the hull. We can take this hull and drop it a mile below the surface, and we're going to have no problem with the hull. But because we're constantly pressurizing the air inside the unit to ambient pressure, the same pressure as the surrounding seawater, well, you still have to follow the same compressed gas laws. That is, if you stay down really deep for a long time, well, you're going to have to look at decompressing, the same as you would if you're scuba diving. If you're going to dive down below 250 feet, you're going to have to charge it with a helium and oxygen mixture.
What if I had to abort at 250 feet?
At 250 feet, you're relatively safe because the air, again, the air inside the system is at ambient. So when you take a lungful of air to get out of the thing and leave it, if you want to leave it and not take the bottles with you, just get out of it and go. The lungful of air that you grab at 250 feet will last an experienced diver to the surface because pressure is being reduced. The lungful of air is expanding, so you've always got a lungful of air, even though you're exhaling all the way up. Of course, it does use standard scuba, so the scuba is all on quick release, so if you want to get out of it, you just snap, take your 2 bottles with you. It's got first, second stage regulators, mouthpieces, and everything, and you just take it all with you.
When do we see the first one on the market?
Oh, within a month. This is my first pre-production prototype. This unit was built with all the master tooling, my proper molds, plugs, and everything that I'll be using in actual production. So I've got this unit is completed. I've got 3 more under construction right now. And I'll be finished the next one within the month. So right away.
Here he comes. That's good. That was a good one.
Who says there aren't young men of perspicacity, genius and stubbornness to do such an incredibly good thing as young Mr. Ross? We're going to go to rather a heavy topic next, and I'll be interviewing Parsegh Kartalian from Los Angeles and Professor Allan Cunningham from Fraser University on, of all things, the 65th anniversary of the barbaric massacre of Armenians by the Turks, the first genocide of the century. After the break. Banners are being displayed at the old courthouse, which I hope never becomes an art gallery, on Georgia Street in Vancouver to make the public aware of the first genocide of the century. An unusual kind of interview for me. Don't particularly relish going back over genocides. Parsegh Kartalian is a spokesman and the leader of the Armenian community in Los Angeles. And Allan Cunningham is a professor who lectures on the Middle East at Fraser University. Let me put to you quite apathetically, Parsegh Kartalian, why should we commemorate a ghastly genocide such as took place by the Turks of the Armenians 65 years ago?
Yes.
Why?
Jack, well, I would like to thank you, first of all, for giving us the opportunity to express our views.
May annoy any Turks who are watching, but nevertheless, let the ball bounce. Why should we commemorate?
This date, as you mentioned, is the 65th anniversary of our genocide. And it's a very important date for the Armenians because it's not only that human beings were massacred barbarically, but the Armenians lost their homeland, or most of their homeland, and they've become scattered around the world. It's not only the human losses or the material losses, which was very important for the Armenian people, but the homeland was also denied now, and the Armenians have become members of the diaspora, for instance. They are living around the world scattered. There's Armenians living in Armenia, SSR today.
This is an Armenian diaspora as distinct from a Jewish diaspora, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, was Armenia a nation state by itself? Because all I have in my little knowledge, which is I'm going to be brought up to date by Professor Cunningham, was Armenia a country itself which was invaded and massacred by the Turkish forces and taken over?
Yes. Armenia was, as we know in history, was the Greater Armenia BC during the time of Tigranes II, was the emperor of Armenia. And today's Armenia is only 10% of what was that kingdom or empire.
What caused the massacre?
The massacre was to solve the Armenian problem as such. The Armenians were living on that land, and the Turks were willing to solve that problem all the time because of differentiality between themselves and the Armenians, for instance, not only in culture, but in trades and all other top positions that they had.
Professor Cunningham, was this a final solution exactly in the grand manner of Hitler and the Holocaust for the Jewish people?
Well, this wasn't the purpose with which the Turks carried this out. And you have to remember the time we're talking about. The First World War, the fact that Turkey took the side of Germany, and therefore against Russia, that the Armenians occupied the 7 easternmost provinces of what is Turkey today on the map, and therefore they were caught in the middle between Russians on the one side, who had a region of their own, which they would call Armenia, and the Turks on the other side. The Armenians, as Christians, therefore had to make a choice, which side to be on. They were encouraged by the Russian imperial government before the Tsar fell in 1917, naturally, to come over onto his side. The reason why, as is often forgotten, the young Turks, who were the people who had carried out a coup d'etat in the old Ottoman Empire in 1908, the reason why these people were, I suppose, doubly offended by the Armenian response to the Russian invitation was that, strange though it seems today, two societies which disliked the Turks intensely, the Greeks and the Armenians, were traditionally rather favored people within the framework of the Turkish administration. So to the Turks, they were scandalized that the Armenians, who used to be called, by the way, in the 19th century, the Sadika Millet, which in Turkish means the faithful community. The Armenians were faithful because they were the bankers and the senior merchants of Istanbul. They were financiers to the state. And so the Turks were very offended that these people, above all, should suddenly become a kind of fifth column. This, therefore, brought down on them the vengeance of the Turks in 1915 for the very fact that they had chosen, by the Turkish definition, the wrong side.
I may have the wrong name here, but at that time, during this particular period, when you talk about the Young Turks, was that when Kemal Ataturk took over the Ottoman Empire?
Well, he's becoming prominent, though not in this connection yet. He has just, in the year we're talking about, 1915, established a very splendid military reputation by defeating the Allies at the Dardanelles.
The Dardanelles, Gallipoli.
The Dardanelles.
Was that Gallipoli?
That's right.
All that nonsense.
Aye.
Yeah. Another day
nonsense,
in the
except for the people who got knocked off there.
That's right.
Sure. But
Churchill's folly.
and so, yes, very much so. And consequently, the intention was that through Gallipoli, the Western Allies would feed supplies to Russia to keep Russia in the war. To the extent that Ataturk stopped them doing this, he's not Ataturk yet, he's just a general called Kemal, but to the extent he did this, you might say he produced the Russian Revolution in 1917.
Yeah, because he prevented the Allies from going through the Dardanelles.
That's right. They stopped the Allies supplying Russia. The Imperial Russian army could not sustain the German attack, and they collapsed.
Okay, when the war was over, then came... Well, when the war was over, did the massacre then come?
No, when the massacre comes during the war, because at the same time that the Gallipoli campaign is being fought, you have the war on the Russian front, that is the Turco-Russian front, which actually is a war which laps over into what is the present-day Turkish Republic.
Yeah.
In the communities and provinces which were predominantly Armenian by population.
In those days, how many Armenians were there prior to the massacres? If that's possible to tell.
History says that there was more than 2 million Armenians living in Turkey.
How many were massacred?
1.5 million were massacred during the 1915 genocide. But the massacres started way back before that, in 1895, during the Sultan Abdul Hamid's reign. And they took over 1 year after the liberations by the Young Turks of the Hamidian regime, for instance, in 1908.
Well, the effort was to stamp out all trace of the Armenian elite who had been the favored in the Ottoman administration, am I right?
The elite were in Istanbul, largely. These provinces in the east were peasant provinces, and the peasant societies were mobilized to take the Russian side. We have some very sinister conversations between the Tsar of Russia and the Catholicos, the patriarch of the Armenian Church, whose headquarters, you have to remember, were in Russia. And the Catholicos is really being told that if the Armenian people will take the Russian side, then they have a splendid future before them. This is the Tsar's phrase. They have a splendid future before them. Now, when, of course, the Armenians responded, they were dependent on the fact that the Russians would win. And as we know, after the massacres, the Russians then lost. When Russia goes under new management, the Bolsheviks, and Turkey goes under new management,
The Young
Ataturk,
Turks.
they once more meet over the heads of the Armenians, agree to redraw the frontier of Turkey and Russia, and of course we have on one side of that line a Soviet Republic of Armenia, but on the other side there is no such thing. There is no Armenian territory.
There is no free Armenia today.
There is Armenia SSR.
But there is no free Armenia today.
No, but we consider that our homeland.
The Soviet Armenian territories.
That's Armenian homeland. That's
Now.
Armenian land. It's Armenia SSR today. That's called the Armenian Soviet Republic.
More on our history commemoration after the break. To Parsegh Kartalian and Professor Allan Cunningham, Simon Fraser, this commemoration of the 1915 massacres is worldwide.
Yes, it's celebrated all over the world today, in the diaspora and in Armenia SSR.
Even in the Soviet
Even
Armenia.
in the Soviet Armenia today.
Now, how many, was there ever a separate Armenian state after this particular Turkish-Russian clash
Yes.
and the massacre?
Yes. Oddly, there was an Armenian state for 2 years, and it not only existed in the territorial sense, but the Armenians actually signed some of the peace treaties after the First
As a
World
nation?
War. Their representatives signed the Treaty of Sèvres with people like Lloyd George in Paris after the war was over. They were recognized by the Americans to the extent that the American Congress became so enthused about the Armenian cause that they even offered to do what we'd like to see them do, and this is send the American Navy to Baku on the Caspian to protect and rescue the Armenians.
They never did.
Well, if you look at the map, you'll see why they didn't.
Oh, I know, they had to go through that narrow thing.
But then President Wilson's geography was rather bad, you know. Amongst other things, he thought that Tehran was the capital of Turkey. And
Was that the time when
and he thought that Prague was the capital of Poland, which explained some of his difficulties.
Do you think Carter's any better?
Well, I think he knows where Tehran is.
He doesn't know what to do about it, does he?
Well, President Wilson didn't know too much what to do about Armenia. He was going to extend a mandate over it. He was, of course, defeated himself in the United States, so there was no such thing as an American mandate, but the intention was to protect this infant Armenian state until it got into its feet.
How, when the Soviet Armenia formed, presumably the Armenian province of the USSR, did many Armenians take the opportunity to go back to Soviet Armenia?
Yes, in
Those who had escaped.
46, 47.
How many?
They went around 200,000 Armenians went back to Armenia to live there.
Are they happy Armenians?
Yes, there are some which are happy and living there. There are some others who are coming out from Armenia, and that's a fact. But nonetheless, those who are living in Armenia and would like to live in Armenia, which is Armenian homeland actually, that's our forefathers' land.
So if it wasn't for the Soviet, if it weren't for the Soviet Union, you wouldn't have any national ground at all which you can call your own.
No, and Professor Marshall Lang says at that time probably it was better to be red than dead, for instance.
The associated problem, of course, is that the Armenians have, because of their nationality, been very suspect at different times in the estimate of the Soviet authorities. So that Stalin, for instance, found it important to be tolerant of Armenian nationalism during the war, in case the Germans, during the invasion, managed to, again, win the Armenians to their
As they
side.
tried to do and did in the Ukraine.
Which the Germans tried to do in that setting. And then, of course, after the war was over, you get the tough line coming back, and he sent Beria to Armenia, and Beria wrote a rather foolish book about the Sovietization of Armenia, whereas the history of Armenia shows how very resistant to Sovietization Armenian people usually are. You know, despite 30 and 40 years of Soviet government, Armenian was taught in the schools. Despite attempts to suppress Armenian patriotic feeling, Armenian literature. If you went to a big bookshop, the bookshop would have no queue for the latest book by Stalin or the latest report by the party. But if you put out a volume of poetry by an Armenian poet, there would be a queue that went round the block.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I suppose it's really, there is no hope now for a free Armenia such as you might have had had things come out differently. But that you are a nation of the diaspora.
But we have always the hope, Jack. We love freedom. Our history starts with freedom. That's why our forefather Haik preferred to go and live in the rugged mountains of Armenia than to be dominated by Bel or the bad man. So he preferred freedom and rugged mountains or Armenia than to be dominated by another person.
Just a little straightforward question. The actual massacre, I presume, was done by armies who raised the country and slaughtered the population with rifle and bayonet?
Yes, it was organized, premeditated, and executed well enough to make 1.5 million Armenians perish.
How many Armenians throughout the world today?
6 million Armenians.
6 million Armenians.
Yes.
You've ridden over this country on horseback.
Yes, yes.
Typical of what? Like what?
Like the extreme north of the Scottish Highlands, like sections of northern Okanagan, high rolling territory, very severe winters, not very well mapped. Armenian communities still all over it in pockets, though persistently treated by the Turkish authorities as Turkish subjects rather than people different by nature of language.
From an historical point of view, therefore, Armenians are a nation to be admired for their incredible stubbornness and refusing to be driven into the ground. Eh?
Yes, yes. There is a splendid book by a Frenchman, Franz Werfel, called The 40 Days of Musa Da, which is a very fascinating novel, though one would have to say a documentary about the subject of the Armenians. And in it he has a phrase which I think sums up their predicament. He says the Armenians have a choice. They can have physical repression by the Turks or spiritual repression by the Russians. And of the two, he thinks they should choose physical repression, because if you survive at all, then your spirituality is still alive.
I was just looking at this book by David Marshall Lang, Armenia, Cradle of Civilization. Good book?
Fantastic book.
Cradle of Civilization?
One of them.
One of the cradles. One of the early civilized settlements of mankind.
Indeed.
Well, anything else you'd like to say? I admire your, you know, I tend to look at the world today kind of cynically and say, another commemoration of another massacre. Where will it all end? I suppose that if you don't look back at history, you'll suffer the same thing all over again.
Yes, this is true. And commemoration is special to communities that don't have a territory. If they haven't got the territory, then they must hold together by other methods.
Is there a comparable group apart from Armenians in the same situation easily identifiable?
Well, there was not so long ago in the form of the Jewish community before they obtained a territory in the state of Israel. Yes.
But there's no way that you can now get your territory back unless the world comes to an end and starts again. Is that right?
Well, until that time comes, we as Armenians, when we're living in the diaspora, first I would like to say that the Armenian communities just after the massacres, when they came to the West and or the Middle East and they established themselves, 5 or 10 years after they were on their feet again, producing, working very hard and contributing some 65 years now after the genocide to the world civilization, to the communities they live in. Loyal, hard-working people, and hopeful for a wonderful future.
Last question. When you look at the Middle East today, when you look at Turkey today, is it now a more reasonable, civilized society, unlikely to become involved again, except where the Cypriots are concerned, in this kind of this massacre, genocide case?
Well, yes. I think one has to remember that for about 200 years it has been common in Europe to throw every possible kind of verbal garbage at the Turks. that this was bound to persist as long as we knew very little about their history or their motives for behaving the way they did. If you look at, say, the history of Greece or Armenia within a Turkish context, there is, after all, another side. This does not condone the atrocious treatment of the Armenian community, but at least it explains why, in a kind of spasm of frenzy, this kind of thing happened. But for centuries before that, Armenians lived honorably within the Turkish Empire, had large opportunities open to them, and in Istanbul were one of the prominent components of the elite of the country.
Well, my thanks to you, Professor Cunningham from Fraser University, and to you too, Parsegh Kartalian of the Armenian community. And perhaps 1 year down the road we might do another commemoration of this dreadful massacre of 1915. Next I'm going to be talking to Michael Livingstone, doctor. We'll get him to diagnose my mental state as I come to the end of the season after the break.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They drummed in.
Despite much publicized advances in medical care, our society is not healthy, our health care fragmented, and the health information we do receive is of uncertain quality. Quite an admission for a family practitioner in British Columbia by the name of Michael Livingstone, MD, who takes time out from house calls to write a book called Family Medicine, An Inside Look. How do I look this morning, doctor, apart from my secret cigarette smoking, my overweight, and my too ruddy complexion?
Well, you asked for diagnosis early on, and I think you'd be far too difficult a case to even try and diagnose.
Why, because I'm awkward?
Oh, well, you're known as being slightly awkward. That is your reputation.
Well, I tend to lie about my symptoms.
Many patients do lie about their symptoms, so I don't see why you should be any different.
Yes, and might I not have full faith in my doctor, but look at him with a quizzical eye and insist at once on seeing a specialist? I want a referral now!
Yes, well, that's fine. The only trouble is sometimes you get into the hands of the wrong specialist. In fact, sometimes you get into the hands of the wrong doctor.
How can you avoid it?
How can you avoid it?
How does one know, a serious question,
Yes.
before we talk about the book,
Yeah.
how does one know that one is in the hands of a competent medical practitioner who will treat you, best he can, of course, with the proper care?
I think, to be fair, I think most doctors give fairly thorough care, and there would be a minority who would give inadequate care.
What I'm really getting at is the system's now so technical and so, not automated, but so tested that the doctor with the proper qualifications has got sufficient backup that he can barely miss something major if he takes the trouble to look for it with all the devices you now have.
The devices are great, but it still comes back to the basic thing with most people listening to what their symptoms are, listening to their problem, examining them. There's a tremendous lot of fancy equipment. Most of it is very expensive. Many problems are relatively simple and do not require all this expensive approach. The other thing about, say, choosing a doctor, which you mentioned, or being satisfied with someone.
I'm very happy with my doctor in case he's watching. I think he's wonderfully terrific. I've never complained. He's just magnificent. There's nothing wrong with my doctor at all.
If you don't know who to go
You're
to.
watching, Charlie.
If you don't know who to go to, you see, you've got 2 or 3 things to do. You can ask a doctor in the community, who's good here, or who's worthwhile going to. They will usually give you a good name. The other method is to ask the head nurse in the emergency department. Don't ask her, they'll just kill me. But if you asked her out to a nice dinner, offered her a bottle of wine, and then asked her who was a good doctor in the community, I'm sure then she'd be only too happy to do so.
Well, that's
because
sneaky,
the nurses
though.
know. Oh, well, the nurses know what goes on.
Okay, I'm going to have my gallbladder.
The underpaid nurses.
Not underpaid
well,
now.
They used to be.
Not underpaid now.
Yes.
Let's talk it on to the nurses. I think they're
Yes,
wonderful people
that's
too.
right.
In case I'm ever in hospital. But if I'm going to get my gallbladder out,
Your gallbladder,
that's
yeah.
what you call it. That doesn't apply anymore though, because you get your fee under the scale of the system regardless. So can you still gold dig as a doctor?
Yes, you can gold dig a bit. Some people will be a little more enthusiastic in operating on you than others. Others might wonder about the state of your liver, so they may not want to operate on you at all. So I don't know which one.
Did I detect a shaft there? I think I did. But
Well, you've got to get your own back somewhere.
Is it good advice that if I'm advised to have an operation, that I should get one referral to one surgeon, 2 surgeons, or whatever they are, 3 surgeons, and then refuse the operation? That's what my old mother or my father used to say.
Sometimes that might well be.
Leave it in the good hands of the Lord.
Yeah, there's a limit to leaving it probably in the good hands of the Lord, and I doubt if the Lord really would want you always to have all your problems all the time.
In his hands.
In his hands.
Tell me more about the book. Why would you write a book? I mean, you're a busy family practitioner. Well, you're
because
Richmond?
I'm crazy. Anybody who
Richmond?
writes a book is crazy. You know that.
Well, you're
I mean,
not
you've met them here.
No, you're not a psychiatrist. You're a GP. I don't accept that you're crazy.
Okay, you have to be a little crazy to write. That's the first thing, because it takes a long time. It's difficult. Writing is much more difficult than practicing medicine. I've met some very interesting people through it, I must say. And, let me say, what did Pasternak? Pasternak said in every generation there has to be some fool who will speak the truth as he sees it. And I think there's an inside drive inside some people that they've got to write down the way.
A compulsion.
Yes, probably,
But
and
I know
you're probably not
perfectly
even
well,
aware of it.
Despite your esoteric medical education, that when you came to write the book, you probably couldn't put 2 words together in a sane and sensible manner.
No, even one word was difficult, even just spelling one word.
How did you overcome it?
By just carrying on writing and rewriting and rewriting, and I fortunately ran into 1 or 2 very kind friends who helped me from time to time, and without whom I certainly couldn't have written it.
All right, what's your favorite story in the book about your training?
I don't know, I think, favorite story.
Think about it
Okay.
while I take a break with Michael Livingstone. An inside look at family medicine. Dr. Livingstone, I presume, after the break. Dr. Michael Livingstone, you have a very good definition of a doctor.
I have a definition of a doctor and also a politician. A doctor is a person who still has his tonsils, adenoids, and appendix, whilst a politician is a person who does not believe in what he says and is always astonished when his listeners do.
We had a very good example of that yesterday on this very program.
Yes, I hear you had Pat McGear on the program. Must have been fun.
Dr. Patrick McPiffle, we called him yesterday.
Oh, I see.
But you came in here this morning waving a copy of Bruce Hutchinson's book
yes,
and telling me there was something you had to read to me, and I said, no, you won't, and you said, yes, you will. So kindly read the extract from dear old Bruce Hutchinson's book, The Fraser,
Bruce
and tell
Hutchinson.
me why.
Yes, well, this is about writing in general. You know, people think nobody knows why they write, but probably deep down, a number of people write. Bruce Hutchinson, writing on the Fraser, which is a classic piece of writing that all good BC people should read, said on the river pilots that steamboated on the Fraser. Steamboating on the Fraser, I suspect, offered higher adventure and more desperate risks than steamboating on the Mississippi, but it had Mark Twain to make it immortal. If he had taken a leaky tub from the sea to the mouth of the canyon at Yale, or through the still fiercer waters from Boston Bar to Lytton, or past Mackenzie's place of wild onions on the upper river, what a yarn he would have spun. No such tale will ever be written now. As is true of almost everything in Canada's past, the great moments of the river lacked a spectator who could give them permanent life. We have left only some scraps of information, a few names, dates, incidents, and a broken hull here and there on the bank. I think one of the reasons you write a book like this, probably subconsciously, is to portray a social situation as it exists in this moment of time.
Quite seriously. And that's a good piece of writing, obviously. What it says
Oh,
is-
it's much better than this, but nevertheless, this still is worth reading, I think, and enjoyable. Mostly it's funny.
I wasn't going to make a comparison on a literary
No, I don't
basis.
think I would. This isn't literary.
What Hutchison says in that, of course, is that the Fraser River lacked a Mark Twain.
Right.
Now, that was purely happenstance.
Right.
We could have had a Mark Twain.
We could have.
We've got the journals of Mackenzie and the journals of Thompson, which are in themselves quite brilliant, perhaps not so written so clearly and lucidly as Hutchison can do. But quite seriously you're talking about the fragmentation of medicine, of the treatment of the patient. Where is the biggest fragmentation? When a person becomes old?
No, I think the fragmentation occurs all the way along. Mind you, it's very difficult for medicine. The more knowledge we get, theoretically, it's more difficult to know, therefore we divide into different specialties. And before a patient knows where they are, they have one problem and they've been referred to 3 or 4 different people. I'm not saying that it isn't necessary sometimes to be referred to 3 or 4 different people. The specialist has an extraordinarily important part, but the trouble is that the more we fragment, the patient tends to get lost between the various specialties, and the more they're told, the more confused they often become.
Well, this is the very problem that I hope is demonstrated in the book, is to the bewilderment of a family when they're facing what is apparently a serious problem. Well, say, for instance, a neurological problem of some kind, and the GP very properly refers it. But when you get into the neurological exploration, you're dealing with, goodness knows how many different forms of new medicine.
Right.
And here is the poor patient who must he wait until everything filters back down after a kind of committee meeting to the family doctor, and is it then the family doctor's duty to relay and coordinate everything that comes back? Is that the system?
That's roughly the system, but it doesn't always work out that way.
Is there any way that can be avoided? There isn't really, is there?
No, sometimes the consultant or specialist takes over completely, which is not always helpful. It depends a lot on the personality and how well they, say, explain things to the patient. Sometimes they get very interested in a particular area of treatment and tend to overdo it.
Yeah, that's where the panic sets in for the family.
Right.
I mean, I know the point you're making with delicacy, in that you may have the best specialist in the world, or the best consultant in the world, but his explanation to the family, well, he's dealing with 150 of these particularly traumatic examinations, perhaps.
Yes.
The patient still wants it really delivered a la bedside.
Right.
From someone who feels like an individual directly concerned with the family. Is that the loss?
That is the loss, and partly it is evolution in medicine. I think in some respects it's coming back because particularly in the United States there's a tremendous lack of family doctors, and people are fed up because they just don't get the answers, and they see a lot of doctors to get one answer. I think this is also one of the reasons for the popularity of unorthodox forms of medicine. That is, people will go to an unorthodox healer of some kind because they want one answer.
They want to be told that...
They want to be told something definitely from one person.
Go to this clinic and they will cure you.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That, of course, is dangerous.
Well, it can be. I think it is very important that the GP or family doctor, call him whatever you like, still retains contact with the patient, still retains contact in the hospital so that he can say what is going on, and sometimes it is not explained to the patient. And occasionally use a little common sense. For example, if you get a very elderly person who has already had a stroke, who arrives in the emergency department, who's probably been dead for 10 minutes, they then try and resuscitate them, and half an hour, an hour's effort is put into this. It sounds great that somebody is trying to save somebody's life, but they will often then leave someone as a vegetable for 3 or 4 days, who will then die. And there is a lack of common sense in dealing with a problem.
And you've raised a subject that I just soon avoid, but I won't. We'll talk some more about it after the break. I basically avoid these subjects, you know, because I'm getting up in years myself. But what you're telling me is really a shocker, horror story. And it's a real-life horror story, in that superhuman efforts will be used unnecessarily to take someone through the last stages of the end of their life and they'll finish up a vegetable.
Well, it just happens sometimes. I know, for example, one supervisor in a hospital who has a little card around her neck, a ring saying no resuscitation, because she has seen this. Now, sometimes, of course, it's a little different when you're dealing with younger people and with a drowning accident or something like that. Then you do everything you can. Mm-hmm. And also, you do everything you can, but sometimes it's prolonged a bit too long. And I think it's a terrifying strain on the family. They have to suffer this through their father, mother, grandfather, whatever, being half alive, half dead for 3, 4, 7 days.
Or
and
3,
everybody
4, 4 years.
Or occasionally for years. And this is where Osler, the great Canadian teacher, did say, maybe in a sense it is wrong, but he did say, oh, pneumonia was the old man's friend. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we go on trying to keep everybody alive at all costs, probably too much.
Do you cover this topic in your book at all?
A little bit, but mostly the book is friendly, simple stories about people. Some are sad. There's a fair amount of humor. We start in medical school, or actually we start with the problem, actually, that faces the doctor, the completely, whatever you do is wrong. And this is on the birth of a baby, where there was a very strong commitment on the part of the parents to a particular way that they thought the baby should be delivered, and the result was a bit of a disaster. Yeah. That is how whatever you did, you were going to be wrong, and the doctor often has to face this.
You've got to be a bit of an oddbird, correct me if I'm wrong, as you will, to go into medical school anyway, where your first job is to cut up cadavers.
Yes. Well, you don't know what to expect. The doctor doesn't know what to expect when he goes into medical school. The nurse doesn't know what to expect when she goes into nursing school. In the main. Mm-hmm. It's a shock. It's a shock to both people. But you do it because either you do it because your parents did it, or somebody thought it was a good idea, or you were interested in medicine, or some people think they're going to make a fortune. You don't usually. The idea is that you do, but...
or you can go to the States and make a fortune.
Or you can go to the States and
there you can still charge what the traffic will bear.
Yeah.
And I can give you a tip on that. The thing to do in the States to make the biggest money is to become a specialist of any kind in preventive medicine and cash in on the hypochondria of the California syndrome.
I'm sure preventive medicine in California would be very good. Yeah, but I imagine television interviewers do quite well down there too, don't they?
But we don't have to make decisions on either, do they, in preventive medicine and life and death? Oh, no, we're very poorly paid compared to the Americans.
Oh, really?
Of course we are. I mean, really.
That's a shame.
But furthermore, we're not in the pork barrel like you people are. I mean, you're in the pork barrel. You, like it a lot, Lumpet, Dr. Livingston, are in fact a socialist.
Of course, we've all been turned into socialized. Yes,
you've been socialized, and you love it.
No, not particularly.
You want to go back to free enterprise and take your payment in a pound of apples and a dozen eggs?
What you're doing is you're going from one extreme to another to enjoy yourself.
Deliberately.
Deliberately, yes, of course.
Now, is it a canard
is that a Scotch word?
I believe it's a French word, old chap. But there's a thing called the Old Alliance, by which we have a number of French words in Scotch dialect, like a wee tass of tea.
Yes.
You wouldn't know either French or Scotch, would you?
No, I wouldn't know French or Scotch. No. The French went over to Scotland.
Were you born in England?
I'm afraid so, yes. I couldn't help that.
You didn't go to a good medical school then?
I went to a sort of second-rate medical school. I went to Cambridge, and then I went to St. Thomas's Hospital in London. And then I ended up at the University of Alberta, you see, which is really...
Oh, my goodness
really
gracious
something.
me. You didn't go to the Anderson College of Medicine or anything?
Well, I didn't go to any of those Scotch medical schools. Of course, they are absolutely excellent. And
did you say you went to Cambridge?
Brilliant. I'm afraid so.
You're as old as Philby? No, you're not. You're just a boy. You mentioned Cambridge. I mentioned Philby. Yes. We were on a serious topic just now.
That's right.
We should do another 5 minutes later with Dr. Livingstone.
If we should say something about the training of medical students and all that sort of thing. And
yes, I will do after the break.
segue into the observatory. Just segue into it. How long do you want to do the intro?
Tell Brian to give me 15 seconds and typed.
15 seconds intro to it, actually. You'll
But-
segue into it about 4 minutes after you can talk.
Brian, give me 15 seconds on a sheet of paper to get into the observatory. In the middle of this segment, I'll be doing it. 3 minutes from now.
9, 8, 7.
I was asking you, is it a canard, Dr. Livingstone, that house calls are difficult to obtain by the ordinary patient from his family physician?
I think they may be becoming a little more difficult. This is probably because of the growth of hospital emergency departments, particularly in eastern Canada. People have got the idea if they're sick, they will go there anyhow, and they're not as used as they were to house calls, so they don't always expect them.
In other words, phone your doctor, and the doctor might well tell you, I'll meet you at the emergency.
Yes, it isn't altogether satisfactory. I've got a chapter about house calls in this book which shows indeed the value of the house call. There are a number of other little subjects that might interest people. There's the look behind what doctors normally talk about in the doctor's changing room. There's a look behind the conversation between doctors and nurses in the cafeteria.
Don't want
and
to
what
hear it.
goes on there. Oh, you'd like that. There's a certain amount of the problems of making a diagnosis and the things that really matter and count. There's a little bit about healing ourselves.
Mind over matter is the answer for perfect health, of course. If you ignore something, it'll go away.
Yes,
you know
it
that
often
perfectly well.
does.
Look at the
Natural.
number of times Jehovah's Witnesses have refused blood
And got better.
and got better.
Yes.
Can you explain that phenomenon to me?
Well, no, the human body is very strong. One of the great things is that how strong it really is. It can take, if you're lucky, you can get away with everything. And some people drink like a fish, they never get cirrhosis of the liver.
Some people don't have a drop and die of it.
And die of it, that's right.
You do cheer me up no end, I must
Oh,
tell you.
I'm so glad to know that you're cheered up.
And you insist on telling me how difficult it was to write and where you can buy
Well,
this book.
Well, naturally. One of the things about writing is that it is a difficult business. It's much more difficult than practicing medicine. And it took me 8 years to produce this rather small book.
What a gestation period.
What?
What a gestation
Oh, yes,
period.
it's worse than having babies. So I'm told by people who've done both. Eventually, I got it accepted for publication, and then they told me it would be 2 years. So in the end, I decided I'd form a company. I called it Orc Enterprises.
I don't want the poetry from Blake.
You don't want the poetry from Blake.
Orc Enterprises. It's a vanity book. You form the
No, it
company.
isn't a vanity book.
You
I put
published
my
it
money in
yourself.
it. No, but I'm not using a vanity press. I'm putting my own money in it. I produced it, and I'm trying to sell it.
The only trouble is you can't get it in the stores.
Well, not later on. You will be. At the moment, you get it from my office in Richmond.
Doctor, how crassly commercial.
Well, you have to be crassly commercial.
How much?
$14.95. It's illustrated.
I've seen some of the pictures.
The average book of 200 pages is indeed that price in the bookstores now, unless it's done by a very large American outfit. And you wouldn't like to support a large American outfit, I'm sure.
You formed your own
to
company
a
and
small
had it
little Canadian outfit.
You had it printed locally.
Right.
Orc.
O-R-C.
$14.95. You're an excellent doctor, I'm sure. An adequate writer.
You haven't read it yet, so
Not
how can you tell?
I'm not that much of a salesman. Best of luck, Dr. Livingstone. You've been a delightful guest. Just stay there for a moment. Just stay there for a moment. Just stay there for a moment. This is a recording. This is a recording. This is a recording. Are you ready? 2 decades ago, a dozen scientists set up shop in the Okanagan in a deserted valley 15 miles south of Penticton. They manned a federal government radio observatory at White Lake. Now all their studies and research could be disrupted. Man-made pollution of the airwaves is causing them problems, says Brian Coxford.
National Research Council of Canada, after a lengthy survey of all parts of Canada, decided that this valley near Penticton was the best area for their research. So they came here away from man's influence and set up their radio telescopes. But things have changed over the years. The Okanagan has become a very popular place to live. And as developers develop, the houses move closer to this site. And it's starting to interfere with their work. A radio telescope consists of a number of very large radio receivers connected to large aerials. They receive radio waves from sources occurring naturally in outer space. But these kinds of man-made inventions interfere with the work at the observatory. They transmit radio waves of a different kind, disrupting the scientific work here. And less than 2 kilometers from the observatory, that was constructed at White Lake 2 decades ago, more fear that a development here at St. Andrews on the Lake will add to the interference. Observatory head man Dr. John Galt is interested in maintaining the status quo.
Well, we're doing astronomy, which is studying matter and energy in the sky rather than in a physics laboratory, as most physicists do. It's part of pure science.
And from a layman's point of view, could you tell us what kinds of work you're doing here?
We're finding out the way stars behave at the end of their lifetime. A star explosion, for instance, scatters matter out in space, and this helps to confirm or change the ideas of star formation, theories of star formation.
This particular site near Penticton, why was it chosen? It was, what, 20 years ago, roughly?
Yes, it was chosen for many reasons. One of the main ones was to be away from man-made interference, because the radio signals that we're observing are so faint that we are bothered by things like ignition noise and small radio transmitters and so on. So we chose a site that was only used for grazing. Ranchers and other agricultural activities, of course, don't cause us any trouble. We picked the site in southern BC to get us close to the border so that we can see the southern sky, and away from the region around Hudson's Bay where there are aurora, which would bother some of our observations.
Unlike an optical telescope through which an astronomer can see the Milky Way with the naked eye, a radio telescope does not form images that can be seen or photographed. But it is a large reflector which collects radio waves from a small part of the sky and reflects them back to a focus. The distance is astronomical, thousands of light years away, billions of miles. At the focus, the radio waves are picked up by small aerials, amplified and sent by cable to a laboratory, then further amplified and over a series of days recorded and transformed into images by scientists using a computer. The receiver is complex, employing hundreds of transistors. Maps of tiny parts of the sky detailing an explosion of a star 10,000 light years away are plotted. And they're studied by scientists like Dr. Tom Landecker at White Lake.
This source can be detected with our 25-meter telescope in 10 minutes or so. We can tell that it's there, but to see the detail that you can see on this map takes a much longer time. It's taken us 72 days with our synthesis telescope to see this detail in here and to be confident that the low-level detail is really there.
Represents what size in the universe?
Well, astronomers measure things in light years. The diameter of this is about 150 light years. On the sky, this covers a patch of sky about the same size as the moon, but because it's very, very much more distant, it really is a big piece of the Milky Way.
I suppose as development moves closer, how's that having an effect?
Well, so far it hasn't had a very much effect on the observations we're taking now. We're more concerned with preserving the site over the next couple of decades, partly because we know that as electronics technology advances, the receivers will become more sensitive, and partly because the first experiments you do are on the strong sources, and then you want to observe weaker sources, which will then be competing more so with the background of interference.
This is the development just over the hill from the observatory, and it's the future residents here that could cause the problems for the scientists. But if the people here spend their $35,000 to build their country home, they're going to have to do without microwave ovens, radio transmitters such as CB radios and walkie-talkies, remote control devices, fluorescent lights, dimmer switches, trail bikes, snowmobiles, chainsaws, and they're going to have to push their lawnmower.
How would a microwave oven, a snowblower, trail bike, or one of those?
Yes, those are really, really bad. Microwave ovens in particular are roughly the same frequency range that we're using with this telescope. Actually, their frequency is between the two frequencies that this telescope is using right now. But the frequency of the microwave oven is not well controlled, and it's liable to splash all over the spectrum. The radio observatories in England have had dreadful trouble with these, and they have written up their results in 2 or 3 British journals so that we are able to benefit by their findings before it really becomes a problem here. If we had them all around the valley, we'd be losing quite a large percentage of our observation time.
To build here, the prospective homeowner has to follow in detail the terms of a land use contract that restrict the use of those kinds of man-made inventions that interfere with the work at the White Lake Observatory. But developers argue that the clubhouse of the golf course in this development was actually here before the observatory.
If the interference is extremely strong, we'll be able to spot it, throw the records in the wastebasket, and observe again the next day. One of the main problems is that it'll be weak interference, and it won't get recognized at this early stage, and so we'll carry on through the data reduction processes and eventually appear as an artifact on the map that isn't real.
There's another side to this argument of man encroaching on the work of scientists in a developing world. It's that if the federal government really cared about protecting the White Lake Observatory, keeping out the interference, it lost its chance several years ago when it turned down an offer to buy up the development land near the radio telescopes. Scientists say they just hope that the land use contracts restricting development can be monitored closely to allow their work to continue for at least another decade.
Just got time to give you some little goodies, some juicy little bits. I want to look at some letters and give you a reprise, good word, of the telephone log after my interview with Dr. Patrick McGeer. It's not McPiffle. And here's the first letter from a Nuvik in the Northwest Territories. I like the attitude. Here in the colonies, we are now receiving you on BC TV. I am watching you with former Postmaster General John Fraser. Should the RCMP have the right to open our mail? God help us if it is to be so. These inept clots have displayed the discretion and intellect of a slightly retarded bore in rutting season. Man with a phrase. They make the bungling burglars of Watergate seem like suave, sophisticated masters to their Keystone cops. The perpetual ongoing comedy roadshow, which is our federal police force, has not displayed the degree of responsibility and honesty that is an absolute necessity for such a solemn responsibility. The only obstacle or inconvenience the RCMP have to fear during the course of their day-to-day antics across this nation is that someone might look up from their crossword puzzle long enough to call a royal commission. A royal commission, what a joke in itself. Definition: a waste of both time and money which never arrives at a satisfactory conclusion. Open our mail. I'd rather live in Albania. Mr. D.S. from Inuvik. Next one. It's from Okanagan Falls. And it says, talking about my interview with a guy from Crown Life, did you notice when you had Mr. Dowsett on that all the calls you entertained were on the subject of pensions, etc.? Is it possible that calls on national unity were culled? Much of the media does the same thing, thereby denying a huge segment of Canada any reflection of their opinions on a sensitive subject. Too bad. LRN, I don't think any calls were culled. Calls came on pensions. Perhaps I didn't encourage them, to which I must plead guilty. My favorite letters from Nanny Moe. There are fools and there are jerks. You, sir, are not a fool. Henry Kessler. One of the girls phoned Henry. I don't like that applause around here. One of the girls phoned Henry Kessler this morning and he okayed his name to go on it, and in Mr. Kessler's view, I am not a fool, for which I am very grateful. Now, I've lost my script. I know that somebody gave it to me this morning. I go through life losing pieces of paper. Here it is. After the interview with Dr. McGeer, that was where Webster and McGeer did a song and dance act yesterday, we received some fascinating logs taken by B and the girls on the switchboard upstairs. And I'd like to roll them now. This is about McGeer. Why doesn't Webster let his guests speak? We've got 400 members of our committee watching and we're all disgusted with this. There's going to be 400 letters going to the CRTC to complain. That's blunt enough. Next one. Next one. You should get Pat McGeer off the air before he gets half killed. Next one. 3 cheers for Pat McGeer. Jack Webster is fast losing all his credibility. I hope to lose some weight as well as my credibility this summer. Love Jack's program this morning. Absolutely terrific. McGeer sounds disillusioned and desperate. It's not fair that you taped the part with McGeer. We'd like to give him a few blasts too. McGeer had to be taped. The doctor had to be taped because he was off to Revelstoke and couldn't make it for the morning, so we pre-taped it in the afternoon. That's why I looked shabby and rumpled in my old brown jacket. That's the only thing that annoyed me about the program. I looked terrible. I may sue the cameraman and the director. Next one. The word Webster was looking for, remember when I was looking for the word? Freddie shouted over saber. It was for machete. It wasn't machete I was looking for. It was broadsword I was looking for. She cuts people with a machete. Who's she? Eh? Who? Oh, Marjorie Nichols, that's right. No, no. She slays them with a broadsword. Next one. Next one. There must be more. There's one I'll read here. I meant it to be programmed, my fault. Tell Webster to tell his audience to dial 420 and not 430. I am sick and tired of taking hundreds of his calls every day. I phoned BC Tel and they won't do anything about it, so I think you should change Webster's number. This is a problem which haunts people on open line programs. If you're one number off one of these numbers, may the Lord deliver you from the annoyances. And I must say, terribly seriously, put the numbers up again, will you? 420, and you can call now, 3336. 420 5525. That's long distance collect. Take a couple of calls, Linda? Would you mind? Thank you very much. All alone by the telephone. Good morning.
Hello, Mr. Webster.
Hello, my dear.
What are we going to do without you until September?
Pine. Pine. Be miserable.
Precisely.
Pine.
Because, you know, you are the greatest.
Here, here.
And, you know, our name is Turton.
What is it?
Turton.
How do you spell it?
T is in Thomas, U-R, T is in Thomas, O-N is in Noble.
Oh, Turton, Turton.
To every morning at 9 o'clock precisely.
Good, good, good. Used to know a fella called Teddy Turton.
No, Kenny is, no, not Teddy, Kenny.
Kenny Turton.
Yeah. We're going to miss you, Jack.
Okay, try not to turn Turton this year.
Huh?
It was a joke. It didn't come off.
You're one swell of a fella.
I'm a little bit too swollen. Some would say in the heat, and I would say in the tum-tum.
You know, Jack, I have been only listening to you for about 3 months. And, you know, I'm the sort of a person, I don't pull no punches either. But you know the majority of people, why they don't listen to you? Because they can't accept the truth.
You mean the majority of people don't listen to me? The majority of people do listen to me.
Oh.
Thanks, Mrs. Turton.
You're one fine person.
Here, here. That's a joke, you know. One thing about me, I've never been big in the heat, but I say take a size 7 3/4 bonnet. Good morning.
Good morning, Jack. How old are you?
62.
52. I don't believe you.
Why?
Because the other day you had a birthday cake.
62.
62.
Hmm.
How come you're that young?
62.
You're younger than I am.
I certainly sound it.
I thought you were 75.
You fiend. Thank you, sir. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Webster.
Morning, madam.
You looked fine yesterday. Absolutely fine.
I need my hair cut. I need my chins trimmed, my hair cut. A bustle job and...
Trimmed all right.
That was good yesterday.
Oh, yes, it was. The only thing is Mr. McGeer, Dr. Pat McPiffle, spoke circles around you. I didn't think anyone could do that. That is, well, you didn't get a chance to put a word in edgewise, did you?
No, I know. It was a shame.
Yes, it certainly was. And I was angry because I couldn't get through.
I'm glad you didn't.
Yes, the soakers got on at the end. They must have been hogging the lines.
It was 50-50, Mother.
I can't believe it.
Okay, love. Go ahead, please.
Morning, Jack.
Morning.
I was rather disappointed in your performance yesterday with Dr. McGeer.
Yes, yes.
You got rather upset. I don't think you should have. You should have remembered, Jack, that you were debating or arguing with the most over-schooled and undereducated person in British Columbia.
Go ahead, please.
I'm still laughing at the last call.
Me too. Go ahead, love.
I've never had a call been on television before, so you know, the delayed phone calls are really funny. Anyway, what the hell are we going to do without you in the morning?
I have no real suggestions, my dear. I suggest you put my picture up on the wall and bow to it 3 times every morning.
3 times?
3 times.
Only 3 times.
But don't bow to the east, bow to the west.
Well, really, you know. How long are you going to be off?
Oh, a couple of weeks. We're back in 2nd of September.
Okay. You better be.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Bye. That's what my mother used to say. Dear old Daisy, big Daisy. Where are you, Daisy? If I'm spared. Never forget that. If I'm spared. Go ahead, please. Hello there. Is there anybody there? Nobody there. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack.
Yes.
I enjoyed your program yesterday very much. I'm a member of the Social Credit Party, but I wasn't proud of McGeer's performance yesterday. Matter of fact, I mailed my membership back to them.
You also phoned yesterday, didn't you?
No, I didn't. This is the first time I have phoned your program.
Okay.
I was disgusted with that man yesterday, and what that government is doing.
Fair enough. It takes 2 to tango, and we tangoed yesterday, and thank you very much. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Webster.
Morning, sir.
Fine job.